For as long as we've had civilization, it feels like there's been this shadow stalking us at the edges, a creature that lives on our life force. Now, it's gone by a lot of names and a lot of cultures, but we know it best as the vampire. So let's trace the incredible evolution of this myth, from a terrifying folk monster to the complex figure that haunts our screens today.
And that's really the key, isn't it? The vampire has always been the outsider, a creature hiding in the spaces just beyond our world, just past the campfire, on the edge of the village, or, in the darkest corners of our own minds. This idea of a predator hiding in plain sight, well, that's the thread that connects its entire history.
So where does this all begin? Where do we find the first real footprint of this shadow? Well, its origins are almost entirely in the peasant villages of 18th century Eastern Europe. See, in a world that's trying to make sense of disease and sudden death, the vampire wasn't some work of fiction. It was a terrifyingly real explanation for things they just couldn't explain.
Okay, you really have to get the modern image out of your head. Forget the pale, charming aristocrat. The original vampire was, it was a grotesque reanimated corpse. It was described as bloated with a dark, ruddy complexion because it had been feasting. This thing wasn't a clever seducer. It was a mindless monster that climbed out of its grave, and it was the perfect scapegoat for plagues, failing crops, or any death that just didn't make sense.
Now, this local superstition didn't stay local for long. In the 1720s, it just exploded into what we now call the Great Vampire Epidemic. You had these cases like Petar Blagovic and Arnold Paulé in Serbia that were actually documented by Austrian officials and then published in newspapers all over Europe. All of a sudden, this village boogeyman was a full-blown continental crisis. The panic got so bad, with people digging up and staking bodies, that the Austrian government itself had to get involved. The whole hysteria really only ended when Empress Maria Theresa sent her personal doctor, who basically said, nope, vampires don't exist, and then passed laws to stop people from desecrating graves.
And this quote from Voltaire, it just perfectly captures the mood of the time. Here you have one of the great minds of the Age of Enlightenment, and he's just expressing total disbelief. His question says it all. You've got a world that's being pulled in two directions, between the logic and reason of science and the powerful, ancient grip of superstition. I mean, how could a rational 18th century person even begin to process official military reports about staked corpses?
But just when it seemed like reason had finally put the vampire back in the grave for good, literature decided to resurrect it. And this, right here, was the monster's most important transformation. It literally traded in its dirty peasant shrouds for aristocratic silk, moving out of the village graveyard and straight into the high society drawing room. And this is the change at the very heart of the vampire's story. Just look at the contrast. The old folkloric revenant was a physical threat, a symbol of disease. This new Byronic predator, it was a psychological threat, a symbol of moral corruption. It was no longer just a monster you were afraid of. It was a charismatic fiend that you might, to your own doom, actually be drawn to. This was the moment the modern, seductive vampire was born.
So how did this new vampire even happen? Well, it all goes back to probably the most famous house party in the history of literature. It's 1816. A storm traps a group of literary superstars. We're talking Lord Byron, Percy and Mary Shelley, and Byron's doctor, John Polidori, at the Villa Diodati. To kill some time, Byron challenges everyone to a ghost story contest. And that contest famously gave us Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But it also gave us another, equally important monster. John Polidori's creation was Lord Ruthven from his story The Vampire. And in creating him, Polidori basically set the template for every vampire that would follow. Ruthven was an aristocrat, he was smart, and he moved through high society like a shirk. But here's the kicker. He was modeled directly on Polidori's own boss, the handsome, brilliant, and notoriously predatory Lord Byron. Polidori essentially turned his boss's personality into a monster, creating a creature whose real danger was in his irresistible charm. So Polidori may have created the template, but almost 80 years later, an Irish author named Bram Stoker would perfect it. He created the single most definitive vampire in all of history, Count Dracula. Stoker's genius wasn't that he invented something completely new, not at all. His real talent was in synthesis. He took everything that came before him, the gross monster from Slavic folklore, the sophisticated aristocrat from Polidori, even a little bit of history from guys like Vlad the Impaler, and he mixed them all together into one cohesive, absolutely terrifying whole. Dracula became the canonical text, It just soaked up all the myths that came before it. He also established the rules. So much of what we think of as vampire lore was either made up or made official by Stoker in his 1897 novel. No reflection in a mirror? Check. Needing an invitation to come inside? Yep. The power of garlic and the crucifix, and of course, the stake through the heart. Stoker took all these different ideas and turned them into the official rulebook for vampire hunters and horror writers for the next 100 years. But it was more than just a spooky story. Stoker made the vampire a powerful metaphor for his era. In Dracula, vampirism is like a contagious disease, right? It's a curse passed through this very intimate, bloody exchange. And that resonated so deeply with all the Victorian anxieties about things like syphilis, sexual repression, and this deep-seated fear of a foreign other coming to invade Britain. Dracula wasn't just a monster. He was the literal embodiment of everything that terrified the Victorian mind. From the Victorian age, the vampire took its most dramatic leap yet, onto the silver screen. And it's here, in the 20th and 21st centuries, that the creature goes through its final and maybe its most surprising transformation. You know, early movies didn't just adapt the vampire, they actually added to the legend. The 1922 silent film Nosferatu, that's where we get the idea that sunlight can actually kill a vampire. Then in 1931, Bela Lugosi's iconic performance cemented that whole image of the caped, charming count with a hypnotic stare. And then, in the 50s, Christopher Lee's Dracula for Hammer horror films made the fangs a big deal and brought this really overt, dangerous sexuality to the character. Film is what gave the vampire its definitive look and feel. But then, a really major shift started to happen. The vampires slowly but surely moved from being the villain of the story to being the main character. Writers and directors started to ask, what's it like to be the monster? And suddenly, the vampire became this tragic, romantic, and often really sympathetic figure, dealing with things like alienation, loneliness, and the struggle to find some kind of redemption. The predator became the hero of its own story. The vampire has always been a mirror. It's always reflected our deepest fears. Fears of disease, of superstition, of sexuality, of foreigners. So, what does it say about our world today that this ancient monster has transformed into a tragic, romantic outsider? Maybe it tells us that our greatest fear is no longer the monster at the door, but the one we see when we look in the mirror.